something I just found out that I could do via Zoom. And I mean, I've been looking for something. I used to use Google Hangouts, and then they sort of made it a pay thing. And then I found this other stuff. So I don't know. I haven't really found something that lets.
I have lost audio from you, Richard. I've got no audio from you.
We do exactly.
Nada.
Nuts.
Wait, there you are.
Oh, I'm back?
You're back.
Good, good. Okay. I'm sharing it on Twitter. There we go. Oh, that's an apostrophe, not a colon. And did I not put the link? Oh, dude, I suck. Okay, there it is. Okay, it's up there now. So we're good to go. And then you can share that if you want to, and then we can get started. I don't know if you saw. Do you see it?
Yep.
Okay. All right, cool.
Your video is frozen. I've got your audio, so I'm not going to worry about it.
Yeah, I think it's a buffering thing, and your video is working fine for me. And then afterwards, we'll just have to see how it comes out.
Sounds good.
Okay. Well, we've been live. Sorry for the technical difficulties. As usual, unexpected. But thank you for joining me. A super special guest today, Bryce Huebner. Bryce, for those who don't know you, can you say something about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a philosopher in the Department of Philosophy at Georgetown University. I have spent most of the last, I guess, 12 years or so working on a bunch of issues at the intersection of philosophy and the cognitive sciences. More recently, I've been getting really excited about some pretty low-level neuroscience. And basically, I'm trying to figure out how to remix a bunch of classical Buddhist philosophy with some contemporary results from both cognitive and computational neuroscience, as well as cultural psychology. I think that's the overview of where I am right now.
Wow, very cool. And so before we jump into all that stuff, because I know you used the word low level right there, but I don't think you mean like low quality. I guess you mean like basic neuroscience or bodily neuroscience or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of what people have gotten, what philosophers have gotten really excited about has unfolded in the domain of sort of neurons firing, and that's kind of the end of the story. And in some collaborative work that I'm doing with a behavioral neuroscientist named Jay Shulkin, we're trying to sort of think about how to integrate into that kind of picture stuff about hormonal regulation and things like regulating various kinds of thirsts and appetites and the role that that might have in larger scale cognition, and trying to think about how adaptation to various kinds of social contexts often takes place through the recalibration of a lot of those hormonal systems.
Yeah, that's very cool. You know, I mean, I think this is very exciting stuff because I feel like hormones are neglected quite a bit in the study of the mind in general. I mean, we'll get to consciousness in a bit, but I just mean just talking about the mind in general. There, you know, I remember when I was in grad school, I had a class on hormones and behavior, and And our professor was like, well, they're almost like neurotransmitters. And I was like, well, but yeah, they are, aren't they? They're just long range neurotransmitters. That's basically what they are.
Yeah,
So,
that's the story.
so I
mean,
think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say from the very beginning of when hormones were discovered, what they were thought to be is chemical messengers that allow distributed systems to coordinate their behavior. So the liver, for example, to coordinate with respiration, or to coordinate with with heart rate, or to coordinate with various kinds of neural processing. Or if you think about probably the most famous example down that road, if you think about Pavlov's whole project was figuring out how the anticipatory regulation of insulin shifts learning. We've sort of dropped out a lot of that story from the thing that we learn about what Pavlov was trying to tell us.
Right.
But for him, what was critical was trying to figure out how it was that insulin regulation was anticipating the ingestion of food, and how that built up the kinds of stimulus response patterns that we see.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, because I mean, the story you learn in like a basic psych or whatever is that's a stimulus response behavior that's sort of built in, and they're like the mechanism's not that exciting. It's like there's some stimulus response in there, but actually the mechanism is pretty interesting. That if it's insulin production, which is or somehow there's a system in there which is determining when the insulin should be produced.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where the neuroscience has gotten way more interesting, is recognizing that it's almost never a single sort of system that's regulating a behavior like that. It's often drawing on multiple systems, including in that case, things like leptin and ghrelin, in some contexts, things like oxytocin regulation, insulin. All those things are generating the kinds of signals that regulate particular kinds of demands and that organize particular classes of behavior. So the story becomes a really interesting story about how all those wet processes interact with what you might think of as more dry processes, which are the sort of signaling and electrophysiological stuff that we're all pretty much familiar with.
Right, the spiking patterns of neurons.
Exactly.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that we've almost, as a field, or at least the majority of people in the field, have put too much emphasis on the spiking and not enough attention to the neuromodulators, the chemicals that are actually carrying the signal.
Yeah, so I think the way that I would put it is that any story that accurately captures the biology of cognition is going to be an incredibly complex story about the interaction of multiple kinds of systems, which are operating over multiple kinds of timescales,
right,
and which are processing over different kinds of signaling apparatuses. And I think that part of what happened early in the emergence of the cognitive sciences was there was a split between people who were happy with the kinds of idealizations that are present in the McCulloch and Pitts type model, and the people who were apprehensive about that. So people like W. Ross Ashby, who are trying to build up systems like the homeostat, which are attempts to capture the interaction between the wet and the dry systems. So a lot of people don't know about that project, but basically what Ashby did was he took 4 Royal Air Force control units, wired them together, and then organized them so that they had a trough of water in front of them, a magnet suspended in the middle of them, and an electrical current running through each of the troughs. When the system was stable, each of the magnets would be in the center. But what you could do was you could perturb the system, and it would then search for different settings using the RAF control units to organize a space where the system would be brought back into equilibrium. And what he was trying to do is to show that you could build up the kinds of homeostatic regularities that would allow a system like that to return to equilibrium when it was perturbed. The problem was that's 4 systems,
Yeah.
that are interacting together. And it's using a very minimal kind of interaction, but that gets us closer to the kind of model I think we want. We want something that's tracking both those kinds of electrophysiological gradients.
Mhm.
We want a system that's tracking the way that different kinds of wet processes are sustaining those and stabilizing them. And we need a story about how over multiple timescales, systems come to be able to anticipate the kinds of challenges they're going to face and how they're able to bring themselves back into states of equilibrium when they encounter those kinds of challenges.
Right. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say that this is in the broad tradition of the embodied camp, right? That the kind of view that, I mean, one, it's a version of it, at least, if not the standard one.
Yeah, I mean, I think, folks like Evan Thompson have been sort of pushing on things in this general vicinity for a long time. He hasn't necessarily been focusing on the same aspects of the sort of anticipatory regulation that I'm interested in.
Right.
And he's been more apprehensive about symbol processing and computation, which I am not super apprehensive about. I think that what we need is a computational story that allows us to bring those kinds of variables in.
Mm-hmm.
And it allows us to integrate all of the great sorts of computational modeling that's been going on with a story about how those other variables are interacting. And I think if you get something like that, you get a deeply biological, embodied, and situated understanding of what cognition looks like, but one that doesn't throw out the computational framework, which I think has yielded a lot of serious benefits.
Yeah. And that's what's really cool about this, the way you're trying to put these two projects together. You're not throwing the one out in favor of the other. Although I do think maybe it leaves you open to certain sorts of, I wouldn't say worries, but at least challenges. So one might wonder where the actual work is being done, because suppose you could replace all those wet systems with some kind of dry system that mimic their behavior. You're going to say that's not good enough, or there's no way of doing that, or can we model those processes or mimic their inputs into the neural systems and then get the same sense of embodiment, or what, like for instance, I mean, to take a left field example, you take phantom limb pain, you chop the limb off, you get a good phantom. I mean, not a good phantom, but you get a robust phantom. So could there be, these kinds of phantoms as well without the inputs, do you think?
I'm not super deeply committed to a story about how this stuff has to be implemented. I think in biological organisms like us, there are really intriguing facts about how these systems function. And we're going to have a harder time understanding that if we don't focus on the wide variety of interacting systems across multiple timescales. So just to sort of think through a couple of simple examples. The first one is thirst regulation. Mm-hmm. We've got a pretty good sense at this time about how thirst is, the quenching of thirst is operating. And it's operating using three distinct kinds of systems. One that tracks the immediate ingestion of a fluid. So if you think about anytime you've been super thirsty, the first drop of a drink actually has the effect of quenching your thirst. But it's not going to stay quenched off of that first drop. The second is a system that's tracking the distension of the gut because of the ingestion of fluid. The third is one that's tracking the osmolarity of the blood. So tracking the salt versus water content roughly. And that's being adjusted through the expansion and the contraction of blood vessels, which is regulated by hormones like oxytocin and more directly by vasopressin. Those systems all work together such that when they all three deliver the same signal, that's the signal to stop drinking. People are kind of bad at this because we've got another system running on top of that, which is our anticipations and our judgments and whatever else.
Yeah.
But if you look at, for example, rats or other kinds of model systems, they'll stop drinking when the osmolarity of their blood crosses the threshold, which means they don't need to ingest any more water. And it's because those three systems are sending signals of different sorts at different timescales, which can then be brought into alignment. And when that alignment occurs and there's no difference between the outputs of those systems, they end up functioning to regulate the behavior of the animal. So here's the question that you're asking. Is it possible to offer just a purely formal computational account of what's going on there?
Yeah.
And could you build some kind of robotic system that regulated its thirst in that way? Probably. I doubt that it's something that a lot of people are going to waste their time doing. And I doubt that working out precisely how the hormonal regulation of the dilation of blood vessels, I doubt that's going to be a part of the story that any viable robotics is going to build in. But you miss what's going on in biological systems if you don't understand how those kinds of processes are working.
Yeah,
So
no,
I think,
I agree
yeah.
with that, but I wasn't really going for the robotic system at this point. I mean, I guess I was going to work up to it, so you kind of headed me off there. But I was more thinking like in a biological system like ours, could you replace those inputs? Because I don't know, so I don't know a lot about the distension of the stomach and all that stuff, but I know the hypothalamus is playing a role via the pituitary gland, regulating all of these hormones that are going on. And so it's the hypothalamus which is involved in the sensation of thirst and also in determining the salt levels of the blood. So it's depending on these other signals that you're talking about, but isn't it the thing which, and so that's what I'm asking is like, couldn't you mimic those signals in a biological system like ours and still get basically the same sensations or not? Are the hormonal aspects really important? I mean, that's the way it actually functions, but I'm wondering like if that's
Yeah, I mean, I'm not positive that I have an answer there. I think part of what you're going to lose out on is the way in which a sensation like thirst is in many ways distributed throughout the structure of your body. You can feel it in the way that your hands are getting tighter. You can feel it in the way that your stomach is responding. You can feel it in the way that your mouth is unfolding. You could probably mimic all of those kinds of signals and generate a phantom feeling of thirst. But I'm not sure. This is I see how this now hooks up to the embodied stuff in a lot of ways. I'm not sure that what you're going to get is that distributed sensation so much as an integrated judgment that you're having those kinds of sensations. And those might decouple in really interesting ways.
Yeah.
I don't really know what the answer to that is. And it strikes me as a really difficult question.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. That's kind of my whole issue with the embodied camp is I wonder about these things. Like, I'm kind of an old fashioned, I like the head. I like what's happening in the skull. I don't like it to be extended very far and those sorts of things, So I'm not saying that I necessarily have commitments to those, but those are some of my preferences. If I had to be, if I wanted things to be the way I wanted them, I would like it to be mostly in the skull that's going on. That's determining. And so when I think about phantom limb pain, it's like I think about the descriptions. They describe their fingernails digging into their palms. They describe pressure at the knuckles when they're making a fist and they can't unclench it, and they describe feelings of tenseness in the muscles. So when I start thinking about stuff like that, I start thinking, well, what is the embodied bit doing? Because it seems like it's the whatever information representational states of the system up there that's determining the way it feels, the way things appear to you.
Well, so that seems just a bit quick to me. And let me say why it feels a little bit quick.
Okay, good.
It's true that in a mature system where you've got a lifetime, or I mean, however much time built up of learning to track those bodily variables, there's no doubt in my mind that what you're constantly doing is building up a model, both of those interoceptive and those exteroceptive sensations. And I also have no doubt that it's possible to run that model in the absence of stimulations from outside once it's built up.
But it needs the bodily stuff to be built up. Is where you're going.
That's my strong suspicion, and I think that that's part of the reason why working through the unbending of bent phantom limbs requires working through things like visual inputs that give you feedback suggesting that you're actually moving the arm,
Right.
because you don't have the ordinary route to tracking the relevant kinds of interoceptive sensations. So what you need to do to adjust the model is use that visual feedback to update the model in ways that allow you to recalibrate. So that suggests to me that there's something that's been built up over the course of a life there.
Right. I see. Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a fair point. I guess I don't see any way of trying to resolve these issues empirically. Is this a purely theoretical issue, do you think, or is there a way we can get, because the embodied people versus like, old-fashioned guys like myself, I mean, I don't know. I understand the body is important. It just seems like the body can be simulated and that's what the brain is doing most of the time. So it doesn't, so I'm not sure what the force of being embodied is. I mean, it's certainly like in the neuroscience textbooks, what they say is, oh, could you just be a brain in a jar? Well, we have some evidence that you need input back from the body. Well, okay, so hook the brain in the jar up to a simulated body, you get that same feedback. So is it just that there's feedback from somewhere, or is it important that it's embodied, is the simulated body embodied enough? I'm not sure how to take these things apart.
Yeah, so I think those are wicked hard questions. I don't think there's any reason to be committed to those things having to be biologically based, whatever the kinds of input structures are.
Mm-hmm.
I think that whatever the input structures are, they're going to have to map the spatial and temporal distribution of the kinds of activity that show up in a body to generate the right kinds of simulated structures. There's no reason that you couldn't build something like that I can think of. But it's a bit hard to think about effects where, for example, the way in which certain kinds of hormones are distributed on a particular day will affect the availability of neurotransmitters on the next day, which will then affect the moment-to-moment updating in various kinds of neural assemblages. In order to get that kind of story, you've got to figure out what those complex temporal dynamics are.
Right.
And they've got to be hooked up, I think, to things that are going to emulate circadian rhythms and all of that kind of stuff to generate anything that starts behaving like it's a person. That seems like a lot of work to do. It doesn't seem to me that it's impossible.
Right.
But I think that, I think that if we want to understand those kinds of patterns, the ways in which genetic and evolutionary and endocrinological and neurotransmitter based and signaling based systems are all coming together at any point to regulate a system's behavior. I think if we want that kind of story, probably focusing on the distributed biological system is our best bet.
Yeah, I think I can agree with that point about actual humans, insofar as we are actual humans. Yeah, it's in that extent, like it's been an overlooked area where people have said, well, all you need to do is understand the neural firings or the patterns or what they encode or something like that. And I think the kind of pressure that you're putting is well placed. And I hope more people pay attention to it. My only question is like, fundamentally, what is it that is doing the work where's the sensation? Because at one point it sounded like you were saying the sensation of thirst is partially in your hands, because of the tightness there or whatever. But, whereas I would say, sounds like, there's a representation of that happening up here or some information about that. And so that's how you experience it. That's sort of what it means to be representational, obviously. But so I'm wondering, like, where is the sensation of, is it distributed through the body on your view?
I think this might be a place to start talking about consciousness stuff more directly.
Cool. We're in the right place for that, Bryce.
Yeah. So let me come at this from a bit of a odd direction.
Okay.
When I was coming through graduate school, I got exposed to a lot of classical consciousness type stuff. I did classes with Bill Lycan on that kind of stuff. I did more neuro-focused stuff with Jesse Prince. So like I was exposed to a lot of that stuff and I just couldn't get into it. I tried, but I couldn't figure out what was super cool and interesting about it. What tipped the scales for me was starting to play around with meditative practices that made me more and more aware of the way that different kinds of sensations were feeling to me. And there's a pretty long story here, but the tool that sort of was most useful for me is a tool called noting, where essentially what you try and do is you try to attend to each experience as it arises. And you can use different kinds of categorization schemes to do this. And probably one of the easiest is using what in the classical South Asian traditions show up as the 6 sense doors. So they have, like us, the standard 5 senses: taste, smell, touch, sight, and hearing. But they tack onto that an additional sense, which is basically thinking or something like that. And they treat that as a different kind of sensory process. So what you try and do is you try and pay attention when any of those kinds of mental events shows up, and you just tag it with which kind of event it is.
Right. No, I've heard that sometimes this can like help you through pain management and.
Yeah, so as you get more and more precise about it, more and more detailed about it, you can start to unpack various kinds of sensations. But even with that really basic one, what you start to experience is the location of various kinds of tactile sensations and the kinds of sensations that they are. You feel itches showing up in particular places on your body. You feel tensions showing up in particular muscles. You start to feel various ways that breathing is shaping the motion of your stomach and the motion of your chest. All of that stuff starts to become the target of your awareness. As you start paying attention to that, this isn't to deny that there's some kind of model going on internally, but what you start to see is that itches are actually patterns of tingling that are showing up on your skin. that patterns of muscle tension are just that. They're patterns of muscles tensing. That the various kinds of tactile experiences that you're having are located in different parts of your body. I think that one of the things that starts to become super clear, especially if you're focusing on tactile sensations and bodily sensations, is that they're not just showing up in your head. They're showing up as ways of reacting and responding to things that are going on in the body. So I think, and this is where I want to say, I think there's something very close in the perspective I want to take to a higher order type thought.
Oh, cool.
The bare sensations that are showing up initially are things that are happening all over throughout your body. Those are being registered in thought. They're being categorized in thought. And how you register and categorize them determines how you orient towards them, which determines their salience. So if you go to the case you mentioned, the case of pain, when you start focusing on the way that pain is unfolding in a particular location in your body, what you can start to do is you can start to pull apart the patterns of tension and the patterns of pressure, the demands that are coming from your body to not put any sort of pressure on whatever that location is, and the affective responses to that, which are unfolding in a different sort of medium.
Right.
And basically, the way that people use these kinds of practices to manage the experience of pain is they pull apart those affective tendencies from the demands that the body is making and the way that various patterns of tension are unfolding. They unpack the physical stuff in the body to the greatest detail possible, and they try and just let the affective sensation be the affective sensation it is without responding to it further. And by doing that, you're able to sort of generate both a more concrete awareness of how the sensation is unfolding, but you're also getting a sense of which processes are going on where in some sense.
Yeah, so I guess I have a couple of things I want to ask you about what you just said, which is there's a lot there. And by the way, I'm really a novice when it comes to these South Asian practices. And I mean, we were talking briefly before. I have tried meditation. I have some familiarity with Buddhist philosophy. Been to a workshop, obviously, where I taught you, but also I went to one in Taiwan on sort of in Taiwan on the connections between higher theories of consciousness and some Buddhist philosophies. So I have a passing familiarity with that stuff. I'm really a novice, and I don't know. I know I should know more. So I want to pick your brain about that. But the first thing, I guess, so if someone were saying, looking at the screen of a TV and they saw, I don't want to say the T word, so I won't say it, but let's say Barack Obama, a pleasanter sight on the image there. And they said, well, there's Barack Obama. And you said, well, no, that's not Barack Obama. And they said, well, yeah, sure it is. Look, pay attention to the screen. You can see how his arm is moving up over here and his finger is there. Well, I mean, that's a really simplified analogy, but you could tell that that person would be making a mistake because what they're looking at is an image of Barack and not himself. So that's not really his hand, and that's not evidence that they're pointing to. So there's a representation of him. So now that's my kind of reaction to what you were saying about the meditative practices, is that you say, oh, I feel it unfolding in my skin or in parts of my body. And I say, well, of course, that's how it's represented to you. So that's the way it feels. But you could have those without the skin, without the arm or whatever. So I'm not sure that really, so the stretching of the muscle or the tension in the muscle, I'm sure there is a muscle that is stretched and it is sending a signal that is being interpreted, but where is the feeling of it? So is it, what would you say to someone who said the feeling is in the mind, which represents it as being in the muscle?
Yeah.
As opposed to it really being in the muscle.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is probably another point where I come much closer to the inactive and ecological sorts of frameworks. It's not obvious to me that there's ever a re-representing in these sorts of cases. There's the things that are unfolding in the body. There's the judgments that are made about them and the affective responses that are unfolding in relation to them. And those things are typically, for most of us, most of the time, bundled together because they unfold incredibly rapidly.
Right.
But it's not clear to me that there's anything that plays the role in your example of the TV that has Barack Obama on it. I mean, I think that what there is what's going on in the body, the way that that's being registered by a wide variety of systems, the way that that's contributing to ongoing processing in the service of allowing the organism to cope with the current situation.
Yeah. No, I know, I'm familiar with all the Cartesian traps that we don't want to fall into.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not suggesting that there's a homunculus
No.
or someone watching a screen, but it is, so I mean, take, the sentence, there is a tingling in the muscles located on the left side of blah, 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 arm midway down, homina blah.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a linguistic representation, but why couldn't it be, it doesn't have to be a screen or an image, right? The point is just that we have ample evidence, I would say, that there's something in the brain, in the neck top, as you guys like to call it, which is carrying information about that. And we know that, or suspect that that's really good enough in a lot of cases, because if I start stimulating right there, you will feel tension in your muscles. You will feel tingling in your left toe. If I tickle the neurons in the sensory motor cortex in just the right way, you're going to have those things. And we know from various cases of, in the parietal cortex, where you can elicit these sensations as of moving an arm, but your arm did not move, and you can have the arm move and the person denies that it moves. So it seems like, well, it's up there that that's where the screen is. It's not a screen in the sense of an image on it, but it's a screen in the sense of a representation of something going on somewhere else. So so if we stepped away from the screen talk, and because I didn't mean to bring the image into it, but
I know. I think that I'm trying to figure out how to put this in a helpful way.
Okay, just tell me I'm wrong, Bryce.
No, so I think you're right that you can hack the system to make it behave in a way that emulates the kinds of things that it typically does. You can do that through various kinds of electrocortical stimulation.
Right.
It doesn't follow from that that's what's typically going on, or that's how the system is typically processing information.
No, I didn't say that, but not to cut you off, but just to jump in real fast. I was more putting pressure on your introspective evidence. I thought that you were saying, I meditate and I have these sort of, I note, or that these experiences are located here and they just seem to be there. And so that seems to me good evidence that they are. And so if you had in a dark room with your eyes closed and, like a Sleeping Beauty type situation where one of you has these electrodes implanted in your head and the other one doesn't, and you had no way to tell, and you were doing these meditative practices, well, it would seem the same to you.
So I want to be super careful there. I don't think you can draw evidence about what's going on from those kinds of practices. I think that what they give you a sense of is how things show up to you.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. You could be totally wrong about that. I think that the more we look at the way that different kinds of behavioral drives are regulated by systems that are operating outside of the neck top, I think it gets really hard to hold on to a view where everything is going on in that space. I think the more we learn about the way that heart rate, for example, is regulating some of those neural processes, I think the more we learn about how the interactions between the kidneys and the liver in regulating calcium and sodium needs and motivating, generating the signal that motivates an animal to start pursuing those things. I think what we start to see is that bodies like ours have evolved such that systems spread all through the thing are doing the work that they can do to keep the animal within the bounds that allow it to pursue vitality.
Yeah.
So I think that at the end of the day, the issues here are going to be super complex. And I don't think that introspective evidence can get it. I don't think that reflection on things like the way that various kinds of sententially organized computations operate can give us traction on it. And I'm not sure exactly how to pursue a lot of these questions at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, they're hard. There's no doubt about it.
They're super hard.
Not in the other sense of the word, but I didn't mean to bring the hard.
No, exactly.
They're real hard, not
Yeah.
hard problem hard. Yeah, so can I come at this from a slightly different direction?
Totally.
So, you know, I'm gonna torture you with my favorite topic, which is the Roomba. You know about Roomba?
The vacuum device?
Oh yeah, the vacuum device. I spend way too much time watching videos of Roomba and cats interact on YouTube.
Yeah.
It's a problem for me. Anyway, so Roomba is pretty cool. So one of the things that's cool about Roomba is that it has a little home base. And when its power is low, it goes and plugs itself in and recharges itself. So, you know, is it on your view that Roomba has a sensation of hunger at that point, or I mean, if not, what? So I'm gonna bring this back to the consciousness issue because I'm gonna bring in the what it's like talk here soon, because my suspicion is that there's nothing it's like to be a Roomba. But I just wonder, like, what your reaction in general to the question is.
So my first reaction is to say that the Roomba doesn't need much beyond a habituated return to a particular space to achieve what it achieves. When you think about the way that biological systems need to navigate complex, often unpredictable environments where sources of food often don't stay in the same place for a long time, or where getting to those places requires enormous amounts of work. You need in those systems, I think, more complex representations of their needs, which can be used in the service of, and I'm using this term way more broadly than many people would be happy with, to regulate, to carry out cephalic regulation. You need them to be able to represent in their heads something about the location of that resource. So to play around with the salt example that I mentioned before, there are troops of elephants that engage in salt mining. And they'll remember where the salt mine was year to year. They'll remember how they got to it. They'll be able to adjust how they get to it if something happens that their original path was not there. And in order to do that, they've both got to represent that the salt was valuable for them and that it's something that they need in order to continue to preserve vitality.
Right. I mean, just to defend Roombas a little bit, they do in some sense retain the information about where the charger is, because anywhere in the house they're located, they can navigate their way back to it. So
How do they do if you move it?
Well, that's a good question. I don't honestly know. My suspicion is that they could find it, but I don't have evidence. I'd have to check on that.
Yeah.
But that would matter for you, that they could find it if it was moved?
I think it helps a lot. I mean, it's going to depend what kind of strategies they have for doing that. I think that gets you down the right kind of trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, what's going to be most salient is the capacity to adaptively respond to unexpected and unpredictable variations in your environment.
Okay. So shellfish are out and elephants are in.
Elephants are definitely in.
Yeah, definitely. But I mean, I couldn't think of something that was slightly above a shellfish quickly, so I defaulted to it.
I mean,
but so Roombas are out, shellfish are in. I mean, shellfish don't do very. I mean, take a clam, but they're not doing any of these things that you're talking about. But I'm not sure like what your take on them either is. But
so at most points in their life, right? As juveniles, they do move around, right?
right, yeah, a little bit.
So I think that to the extent that they're engaged in a search for what's going to best optimize their vitality, I think you're getting in the right direction.
Yeah.
I have no idea. Yeah.
I love the right direction, but see, so I guess we've said enough for me to ask the next part of my question, because I don't want to press you too hard, but so the Roomba versus, mildly sophisticated, I don't know, let's say, I guess a cockroach, something that's fairly sophisticated, but not too sophisticated. So one we're going to want to say is conscious, and the other, I'm guessing, you're not going to say is conscious.
Trying to think about exactly what I think here.
It's okay.
And I don't know.
An hour before to figure all this out.
I don't know that I have a settled opinion on the issue. I find the idea that living things in general have a minimal and rudimentary sort of awareness to be pretty plausible. I can't defend that. I think that what we see is gradations in how many sorts of things an animal has to be aware of and how salient the trade-offs between them are. And my rough inclination, this is super speculative and I have no way of defending it, is that it's the trade-off between different classes of demands that generates something that we're typically happy calling experience.
Okay. Yeah. No, I love this. I love speculative stuff, and that was a good one. So yeah. So I mean, you didn't say it, but no Roomba consciousness, right?
I think that's right.
Okay. So then does it make sense for you to say that there's nothing that it's like to be a Roomba, but there may be something that it's like to be a tree, or speculate, that was your speculative point, I guess, but to be a fox or something like that. So at that level, that kind of talk makes sense to you, or does it not still?
Yeah, it totally makes sense to me.
Okay. Because I thought you were like more of a hardcore skeptic about the usefulness of I mean, maybe maybe I think what you're, I mean, to put words in your mouth, I thought what you really were skeptical about was the way that it allows this blanket intuition that there are these simple things like red and pain, when really they're more complicated. And so I thought that was what you were trying to resist, rather than just saying there is something that it's like to be us. And that really is the puzzle of consciousness, isn't it? To explain what it's like to, why there is something that it's like to be us. Because we could be like Roombas, where there's nothing that it's like to be us, but there isn't. And you have a story about why it's this complexity and the trade-offs, but still that's a story about why there's something it's like to be us, right?
Yeah, so I think I said at a number of points that I'm pretty sympathetic with something like an illusionist picture. The bit of that I find really promising, which is a bit that Keith Frankish has been trying to clarify, I think, in recent stuff, is that what we find is complex networks of behavioral and responsive dispositions. I think there's a version of that I really think is right. And if it turns out that there's something about the way that affect functions, or something about the way that hedonic value functions that generates something distinctive in biological systems that leads us into a space where we want to talk about consciousness in a more rich way, I think I'm okay with that. And I think that there, what we go looking for is the way in which those kinds of systems evolved to produce the kinds of adaptive behavior that we find in humans.
Right.
So, but when you get down to the things like single-celled eukaryotes or shellfish or wherever we want to put the line, part of what we have there, I think, that gives them a sense of awareness of being an entity in a world in a really thinned out and rudimentary bare bones sense,
Right.
is that they have to be able to adjust their own behavior to deal with variations in the structure of the world. And they have to be able to track variations in their internal environment in ways that lead them to engage in behaviors in the world.
Right.
And once you have that up and running, I think that you're on the road towards something that looks like experience. I don't know exactly what to call it.
Yeah. So, okay. I mean, that's you're hedging your bets a little bit here, I guess, which is fine because this is tough stuff. But I mean, when you say you're on the road to something that looks like experience, well, how far down the road are we? So well, maybe let me see if there's something in the background that's lurking here, because
Yeah.
I know you have more sympathies with like the approach that Dan takes than I think I do. But one of the things that I'm talking about Dan Dennett. There's lots of Dans out there.
Yeah.
One of the things that he says, which I've always found really puzzling. By the way, I hope to talk to him someday on this. And I talked to him recently. He said he's trying to busy for this year, but maybe next year he'll do interviews. So we'll see. But anyway, one of the things I found very puzzling about his view was that he thinks there can be gradations or shades of experience. So that he thinks it makes sense to say that there are things that are kind of sort of experiences and kind of experiences. And I've always found that extremely puzzling, to be honest. So I'm wondering, is that in the background of what you're saying? Is that there may be gradations or shades from us towards these more simpler things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I would say there, and I think this is close to Dan's reason for thinking it too, is that in biological systems, there are almost never going to be sharp lines.
Right. But almost never is not never. So,
Yeah, and
maybe one sharp line.
it's not obvious to me that there's any reason to prefer a lights on versus lights off notion of awareness to something that's closer to a dimmer switch.
Right.
And I think that part of what's going to happen is you probably are going to start to see in biological systems something that looks more like, that looks almost like a qualitative shift. When you start seeing systems that are capable of registering multiple demands that are being placed on them and evaluating which way they want to make the trade-off in the service of pursuing vitality.
Right.
The more degrees of freedom you get, the more robust the kinds of things you can experience is going to be. And that's going to be a gradation, but that's going to be a gradation that's fine with everybody.
Right. Exactly.
But I think the switch between, if there is one, between just having one class of needs that you need to satisfy and having multiple that you need to trade off is going to generate something that looks close to a qualitative shift.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with all that stuff. And I guess I just can't hear it in any other way except for that there's awareness or there isn't, but then there's gradations in how aware you are.
Yeah, so that's the second bit where it's a matter of how many, on this kind of picture, how many systems are yelling at you and how many of them you have to navigate.
Right. So, but still, it seems to me that you haven't really weakened the idea that a system is either aware, full stop, or it isn't, full stop. And then where the shiftiness comes in is in the content of the awareness. So that's, I mean, I get the idea. And I thought, Dan says a lot. Evolution is a sloppy thing and there's never sharp boundaries between us and, the next species over or whatever. And I 100% obviously agree with all that stuff.
Yeah.
But it just still seems to me that I just can't wrap my head around what it would mean to be sort of aware of something unless it meant I was aware of it, but only in a certainly nondescript way. So that the aware, so you are just aware of it, but in a vague way or whatever. I can't make sense of vague awareness. I just conceptually don't understand what it means. And I'm not trying to get you to say it, defend this view. I know he says try harder, and I've tried to understand these things. I just don't see that as
so I think I'm probably closer to you on this issue in a lot of ways. I think that part of that is driven by the undefended inclination towards a kind of biopsychism.
Yeah.
Because once you go that way, I mean, consciousness is kind of everywhere.
Yeah, I know.
Biologically, to different degrees.
I love biopsychism. I talked to Monica Gagliano on the show, and she's defends plant consciousness and stuff like that. I'm open to that stuff. It just seems to me that at that point, you really want to make some distinctions because
totally
the kinds of consciousness that plants have, which I think they do have some kind of consciousness actually, but I think it's more like what we call creature consciousness. I think they do simple, you can train them Pavlovian stimulus response stuff. She does really cool experiments about the roots growing in one way depending on whether a fan was blowing. So it's just awesome stuff. But still, it seems like that's the sort of stuff which happens in us unconsciously without our awareness of it happening. And so it seems, if you sort of just make the distinction between the experiential aspect of consciousness versus being aware unconsciously of the environment, then I'm happy to extend plants that kind of thing. But I don't really see why we would want to extend experience to those sorts of things. At least the evidence.
I mean, maybe this is tied up with the other half of the thing that I wanted to say there, which is, I think we're, in general, really bad at tracking what we're actually experiencing. I think that we experience a whole lot more than we take ourselves to experience. And it just drops out of our awareness so rapidly that it just never gets folded into whatever kind of ongoing picture we're generating of the world. But I think that you can, trying to figure out exactly how to put this, you can work to pull apart the contours of how your experiences are unfolding. What's unclear is whether doing that is generating new classes of experiences, right, or revealing stuff that's already there.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a question that I don't know exactly how to answer. But the more you work at that kind of practice, the more clear it becomes that things that you've typically taken to go on without recognition are perfectly plausible objects of conscious awareness.
Yeah.
And so it just makes it hard to know how much stuff actually is just going on unconsciously. I mean, that's a hunch that a lot of people have, that a lot of stuff is going on unconsciously. I think learning can go on unconsciously. I think that the stuff that Haquan has done on this stuff is absolutely beautiful. On
the fear conditioning stuff?
The fear extinction stuff.
Yeah.
I think that works really nicely to show that you can learn using non-experiential routes.
Yeah. I think it's Vincent mostly who's done that work, but Haquan's tagged along.
Yeah. Got it.
But definitely. So, but what, you don't take the kind of HM stuff as evidence for this, just more traditional stuff. Joe Ledoux tells this story about one of the split brain patients that he worked with, where he what's a split brain? I forget. Anyway, so he tells a story about this guy. No, I think it was HM actually. Sorry. Anyway, where he put a thumbtack in between his fingers and shook the guy's hand and gave him a poke. And of course, he pulled his hand back and said, "What the hell?" But the next day when he came back, he went to shake his hand again. And the guy said, "No, I don't think I'll shake your hand. It just feels weird." So isn't that a case of learning unconsciously?
I'm not sure I follow why it would be.
Well, they don't have, well, at the time it happened, they had a conscious experience of the pain, right? So they weren't unconscious at that point. So they, at the next time that they saw the person, have no recollection of that ever occurring. I already heard the objection in my head, so I already came to it. Sorry. So they were conscious when they experienced it.
Yeah. And it's also going to be really important to remember that in all those kinds of lesion or neural damage cases, the examples are really hard to draw much of an inference from, because in HM's case, for example, there were preserved bits of the MTL.
Yeah.
Right, that showed up. Yeah. And what's going on there? I don't really know exactly how to approach that. And how it felt from his perspective, I think, is a question we're never going to have a really good answer to, probably because the right kinds of questions never got asked. But those are the questions that really matter, is how things are showing up from the perspective of somebody that has experienced that kind of neural trauma.
Right. Yeah, right. No, that's a great point. So you're skeptic about unconscious processing in general, or just unconscious learning?
No, I'm skeptical about neither. I'm skeptical about the claim that some kind of process could go on unconsciously. Therefore, it doesn't require any kind of ongoing awareness.
Okay, and why are you skeptical of that claim? If it can be done without consciousness, then why would you think consciousness is required to have it done?
I don't think that that's ever the right kind of question to ask. I think that when you start asking those kinds of questions, you fall into a assumption about things being necessary in cognition, or things being sufficient to drive certain kinds of behaviors. And I think in general, what we're trying to figure out is how things actually go on.
Mhm.
Sometimes, I mean, I think there's loads of interesting work that's coming out right now on, for example, the role of taste in regulating eating behavior. It turns out taste is not doing the full amount of work that you might think it is doing, but it is doing some work. And it's serving to amplify and modulate particular kinds of behavioral responses.
Right.
I think that when we start to see that, what we see is, yeah, you could probably knock out the taste system and still get a system to adjust its eating behavior. But that's going to tell you something about how a system where taste has been knocked out adjusts its eating behavior. I think in general, what we see is that those kinds of experiential factors are playing a role in anticipatory judgments. They're playing a role in, to go back to the salt case, the taste of NaCl is used as a signal by a lot of herbivores for the presence of other kinds of minerals that don't have distinctive tastes. So at a single shot, you can get a animal that's been depleted on some of those minerals to learn to approach NaCl on the basis of their need for those other kinds of minerals. They're doing it because the taste delivers a particular kind of response that serves as a signal for the regulation of their ongoing behavior.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot. So as you were saying, I was thinking, I think a lot of, I mean, I'm starting to think there are really two different approaches to the neuroscience of animal behavior. One of which, how do I put it? One of which assumes that brains started off without experiences, but still driving complex behaviors. So that they started. So the general idea would be that brains, as at the default, are not conscious, not I mean experientially conscious, not in these other senses of the term. And then over time, somehow what we call experience shows up, and we have to tell a story about that. Whereas the other approach assumes, I guess, that, well, they always were, even in their simpler, some kind of experiential aspect there. And these are just, so I hear you saying that latter thing, whereas like kind of Ledoux, I think, has the former perspective in mind.
That seems right to me.
Yeah, and I just don't know how to reconcile. I mean, you guys are both doing serious neuroscience. So how do we reconcile this basic thing about whether brains can do complicated things without experience or not?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have no answer to that kind of question. It does seem to me that this is a place where there's a great deal of room for philosophical reflection. But the kind of philosophical reflection that seems useful to me is reflection on what kinds of roles consciousness can play in organizing and regulating behavior. And once you get those kinds of stories up and running, you can start to figure out what the underlying processes and mechanisms are that drive them. I think that this is probably the driving force behind my worries about a lot of stuff that shows up in the philosophical discussions of consciousness. Is it's kind of assumed in a lot of cases that we know what it is to be conscious.
Yeah.
We know what it is to have particular kinds of experiences. I think we're really bad at that, and we don't really have a good sense of it. And I think that what we probably need to do is chip away at those questions about what is it doing? Why are tastes functioning in the way that they are? Why are smells functioning in the way that they are? Why are various kinds of bodily sensations functioning in the way that they are? And I think that, you know, if you look at, for example, Colin Klein's book on pain,
Yeah.
I think it's a beautiful example of this.
Yeah, great
You know,
book.
trying to figure out how pain serves as a demand on coping behavior. I think once you have that story, you can start to work back to what kind of implementation is present there. And that
Yeah.
gives you a much better handle on asking the questions about animal pain.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my worry is that if you take the other view seriously, which I mean, my issue, my attempt, I want to take as much things seriously as possible, because I don't my whole. Sometimes people think of me as a dogmatist for some reason, but really I'm like super open-minded. I just like evidence and argument. But I mean, I'm willing to take anything that's seriously. But sometimes it's hard to know what's serious. Anyway, okay.
Yeah.
So take this idea that the brain is fundamentally, they showed up non-consciously, you know, and that includes, I don't know how far back you'd want to go, but let's pick on bees for a second. You know, bees have brains and they're not that complicated, but they do fantastic things and they understand more trigonometry than I do. Anyway, so they do all kinds of funny dances and they are pretty sophisticated. But, you know, could a bee do what it does without experience? Well, it seems to me that I can make sense of that idea. I don't know because I'm not a bee, but and I'm not saying that I think bees lack consciousness or anything like that, but I'm saying I can entertain the possibility that a bee is kind of an autonomous, a fancy, not an automaton, I guess I say, but a sophisticated information processing without experiencing machine. If that's the way that you think about bees, then it throws into question what role consciousness has at all to do with behavior. It just doesn't seem like it, if that's your approach, that you're going to connect it to behavior until much later. And it's going to be way high level behaviors.
Yeah.
I mean, you could still do all the same neuroscience and wonder why bees behave the way they do. And you can still say they're aware of the environment. Even if bees don't have experience, I think it'd be wrong to say they lack an awareness of the environment. Clearly they do. They wouldn't be able to move around or respond to it. They have an awareness. But is it a conscious awareness? Is it experiential? I think that's where the stuff that you don't like about the consciousness stuff is important, though, because answering that question sort of matters, right, to how we treat bees and the way we think of them.
So maybe you can help me here, because I think this is exactly the point I always get hung up on. What we know about bees is that they can carry out complex discriminations on the basis of things that we would happily call colors, scents, and smells, or colors, scents, and tastes.
Some of us wouldn't be so happy.
No, so what's that?
I said some of us wouldn't be so happy to call those things colors.
No, so if they were occurring in me, right, the things that are occurring in me, the bees are tracking things that show up to me as colors. They're tracking things that show up to me as scents.
Yeah.
They're tracking things that show up to me as tastes. They're evaluating trade-offs between those, and they're calibrating those against things like the risk of predation and the things that they've learned about likely rewards in particular kinds of contexts. Take all of those kinds of discriminatory capacities, put them in whatever kind of computational and functional terms you want. What is the thing that's missing for you?
Oh.
When you say that they're not conscious.
Well, I didn't say they weren't. I said I can entertain.
No, I know. So on your supposition that they're not conscious.
Yeah.
What would be the thing that's missing?
Yeah, I'm just as vegan as you are, Bryce. I love the animals just as much as you do. I don't want to deny their consciousness. I know I work with people who do say things like that, but I'm interested in the methodological issue, which is kind of what we're talking about right now. It's a scientific question about what counts as evidence and so forth. So my common sense view is that they probably are conscious, but still, if I can make sense of the idea that they're not, and if they weren't, then what they would be lacking is a point of view which they experienced, which for them showed up, as opposed to just the way the Google self-driving car navigates the environment without such a point of view. So there's an informational point of view, but there's no experiential point of view.
So add more things that bees can do into this sort of story. Bees can distinguish between internal changes and external changes. They can track vibrations outside and realize that there's something going on outside of them, not inside of them, suggesting that they're doing at least a rudimentary computational sort of representing the difference between self and world. They're representing those properties that are what we would call taste, smells, and colors as properties of the world and not properties of them.
Right.
So I still don't get what's missing. I don't get what the
the question is whether, if anything were missing, it would be that there was anything that it was like for them to do those things, which those things seemingly to me possibly can be done completely without there being something that it's like from the bee's point of view. It could be going on in the dark without experience. And the behavior would not give you any indication of that because they would still be representing all the same stuff. So that's why I think, that's the puzzle of consciousness. That's what we want to understand is, okay, so why, so let's just give the bees the benefit of the doubt, say they're conscious. Why isn't it done unconsciously? Why is there any kind of experience associated with those things that you just talked about, instead of them happening without experience? That's the famous hard problem of consciousness. That's all it is explaining why experience has to be associated with any kind of information processing, representation, or behavior.
Because it would take too much model power to drive the kind of online adjustments between multiple kinds of demands in the service of preserving vitality.
Well, I agree you can give an answer, but I'm just trying to see whether or not you understand, whether we agree on what the problem's supposed to be and why people are.
I struggle with it. And I don't mean to come off as pig-headed around this.
No, I know you're not.
I really don't understand what that problem of consciousness is supposed to be. I understand when we're asking questions about how different kinds of biological organisms cope with their environments and what kinds of sensitivities they need. Those kinds of questions make sense to me. And I feel like I'm missing something when I get told by lots and lots of people that there's a further question about what it's like for them.
It's not that I want to say there's a further question about what it's like. It's that I want a further explanation about why there's something it's like for them, as opposed to there being nothing it's like for them. Mm-hmm. So it's that request for explanation which is driving it. We're not trying to nail down that there's some extra fact there. If they're conscious, we assume that fact is there. Why though? Given that it seems conceptually coherent that they could be doing all that stuff without experience. It sounds like what you're saying is you're going to go towards the zombies are not conceivable. I don't mean to bring up the Z word, but that this is not even something that's a coherent scenario that I'm describing, that there could be something with that sophisticated a level of behavior doing all the stuff you're describing, but for which there was no experience.
That's my strong bet.
Yeah, but why do you think that?
I mean, I think to generate a thing like that, you'd have to change all the ways that biological systems cope with the world. You'd have to change all the way that physical processes implement that.
Yeah, but you still, I
And
mean, not to
I have no idea
press
how
you too
you'd
much, but
build
you
a
haven't
world like
said
that.
what about those things necessitates the experience. So
I
why
don't
couldn't
really
it be done without it?
yeah, I don't think it's ever helpful to look for necessities in this domain.
Well, what
I mean, I
explains
think
it then?
that's, what's that?
What explains it then?
What explains which?
What explains why animals or organisms with those capacities end up having experience?
So I think that what my inclination to do in every one of these cases is to say, take a particular experience that a critter has and try and figure out what's happening in the critter that produces that experience. There's
Yeah, but
probably not a general answer.
yeah. Well, some people might think it's question begging because you haven't given an explanation of why the experience is there as opposed to doing that very same thing without experience.
Yeah. I mean, and that's when I just don't know what experience is supposed to be.
Well, the difference between you and the Roomba or the bee in the Roomba is one of experience.
There's a lot of differences between me and the Roomba, or between the bee and the Roomba.
One's round.
Yes. One has a dedicated charging situation.
Yeah, exactly.
One chases the cat around the room,
Yes.
or is chased by the cat, or is ridden upon by the cat.
Yeah, that's usually what happens. Exactly.
Yeah.
But still though, I mean,
Yeah.
the Roomba driving back to its charging station doesn't experience its location in space, where the charging station is, that it's low on power. It represents all those things, experience them. So at some point, experience shows up, and we want to know what explains that. And it sounds like what you're saying is, I want to explain the behavior. I want to explain why the animal behaves and I want to say, okay, so it's this system that regulates that behavior. And that's wonderful. And I love all that stuff. But it doesn't seem to me to give an account of, well, I can't just repeat myself, but there's no other way to say it, with the experiential nature, what it's like from their point of view, why there is a point of view. That's the most fundamental question. Why is there something that it's like to be a bird and not something that there's like to be a Roomba? And if the answer is just their behaviors are different and they have to manage more computations, then I guess I lose my grip on what it is you thought you were trying to explain.
Yeah. I mean, I think we need to be super careful there, because when you say that what I'm suggesting is that what we want to explain is behavior, that's partly right. But I think that telling the story in that way reduces the claim that I'm making to a version of the kind of computational process story where all of it's going on in the head.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to do that, but I see what you're saying.
And so I think this is exactly where the distinction between the two approaches to the biology of cognition are probably feeding into differences in how you think about the relevant class of questions. If you think there has to be a story about when and where experience turns on, given an evolutionary history of non-conscious organisms, then I think you face precisely the questions that you're raising. If instead what you think is that rudimentary forms of self-awareness and awareness of the world show up as soon as life is on the scene, and then become complexified through the various kinds of shifts in the demands that an organism has to cope with.
Yeah.
I think you've got a story, and the problem becomes one of why biological systems emerged in a world where there were no biological systems.
Yeah.
That's its own kind of hard question.
No, definitely.
But I think it puts the so-called hard problem in a different place.
Yeah, I know. But the question is, which one should we buy? Because I haven't given any reason really to go yours or my, or I'm not really saying that's my way, by the way. I don't want to be pinned with that, but it just seems like that's the question is where do we, why should we plunk for one versus the other? And I mean, and just to come at this a different way, it seems like you're smuggling a lot in with life, because why isn't Roomba alive? I mean, it's got self-regulating behavior. I don't know. So anyway, it sounds like you're building in already to life the idea that there's consciousness, which doesn't answer the question. So we could just pose the same question again. Why does it show up with life and not with these non-living systems? I mean, yeah. So I just seems.
Yeah, I think the answer there is something in the vicinity of what I said earlier, and that I think that Evan Thompson has defended pretty well. That from the very beginning, living systems have had to be able to chart their way through an unpredictable and dangerous world where they've got to figure out which trajectories are going to allow them to survive and flourish.
Yeah, but what systems are you calling living in that story?
Eukarya,
proeukarya, virus, what?
I think viruses are a hard case, and I don't have a settled opinion there.
Okay.
But I think single-celled organisms of various sorts, bacteria, show lots of interesting behavior that are suggestive of an awareness of the difference between what's going on in them and what's going on in the world.
Right. I mean, it's just interesting because that's exactly the case that someone from the other side uses as the reductio. So they say, look, if you think that these things have fear responses or pain responses, like, because they go away from noxious stimuli, bacteria does, obviously, they seek out things that are nutrient to them. So some people will say, well, we don't want to say that they're feeling pain, so we have to draw a distinction between behaviors and experience. Whereas you're saying, no, the behavior is indication of the experience. So it just looks like we're at this fundamental.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I want to say that they experience pain. I think I don't have a settled opinion there.
Okay.
But I think that when you see things like bacteria,
some negative hedonic value, though, at least.
Yeah, they're registering toxins and avoiding them, and they're registering foods and pursuing them. But they're also, in the process of that, they're adjusting the structures of their bodies to succeed in navigating those kinds of situations. So they're projecting flagella out in certain kinds of environments. They're generating things that look roughly like legs to walk across dry environments. And they're doing that in ways that are sensitive to what's going to allow them to pursue vitality.
Right. But I mean, you mentioned vitality a lot. I just like this a non sequitur, but I just wonder, do you think there could be any other organizing principle? Maybe not vitality.
I think that's one that shows up in biological systems.
But in a non-biological system, you could have, maybe something else might be the organizing principle.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, I don't want to get too distracted because there's too many. I mean, I've already been chewing your ear for a long time, and I'm sensitive to your condition. Which, by the way, thanks for joining me with your. I know you've been saying on Twitter how you have these bruised ribs and pneumonia. I don't know what happened, but geez, you seem okay.
Yeah, I'm doing all right.
Okay.
I'm on the mend.
It's not related to the virus that's going around.
As far as I know, not.
Yeah, I know. As far as we know, no one's getting tested, but.
No, exactly.
Okay.
But I'm isolated and staying isolated until I'm healthy.
Okay. Well, good. We need people like you, Bryce, in the profession. By the way, I was going to say this at the end, but I just want to say your presence in the profession is tremendously appreciated, at least by me. Your demeanor, your approach, your professionalism, your mentorship they're exemplary, and I hope that they serve as examples to other people. I really, really mean that. So I want to thank you for that.
Thank you very much. It's very kind.
Yeah, no, I mean, just your presence on Twitter is one thing. You're very kind there, generous with your time, but just that's how you are, really. That's not an act, that's you. So we need more people like you in the profession. And I'm hoping that we're training such people now. Anyway, so I guess let's see, I wonder if I could switch topics a little bit here, because there's a couple things I wanted to bring up with you before I let you go. One of them is aphantasia. Because I know you talk a little bit about that on Twitter. So and a lot of, and I have that as well. It's not diagnosed, but I do have a version of it, I'm pretty sure. And a lot of say, oh, well, that's why you're an illusionist, you see, because you have this condition. And that just seems to me so bizarre, because mental imagery is one thing, but conscious experience, I mean, I'm looking at you right now. That's not, that's a completely different thing. So what is your take on that? I mean, is mental imagery important and real or not?
I have a speculative hypothesis there too.
Okay.
Which I think actually sits pretty comfortably with a lot of the positions that you've been floating today. I think that with mental imagery or auditory imagery or tactile imagery or spatial imagery or whatever else, what you're getting is the virtual projection of whatever is going on below the surface. And the reason I think that we should think that is, to the best of my knowledge, people have struggled to find real noticeable effects of the presence or lack of visual imagery in psychophysical tasks, for example. So if you take the standard mental rotation tasks using Shepherd blocks, they don't seem to have much of an effect. There doesn't seem to be much of an effect driven by mental imagery. So that suggests that it's pretty far downstream what's going on.
Can you just clarify? Because I thought some of that stuff was that, it takes about as long to mentally rotate it as it would to physically rotate it, which is part of the evidence that it's an actual image or something like that.
Totally.
So what's the non-effects then? Maybe I misunderstood what you were saying.
So I'm reporting this secondhand. So I haven't actually looked closely at the relevant data. I don't know if it's published yet. If it is, I haven't seen it. But what I've heard from a bunch of different people is that precisely that effect, that the amount of rotation that's required dictates the amount of time, doesn't yield an effect on, or mental imagery in that case doesn't yield an effect. So whether you're capable of imaging or not, you show the same rotation time effects.
Yeah. I've read that too.
So in a sense, what that seems to suggest is that the thing that's doing the relevant class of visual spatial manipulation is not what's going on when you generate mental imagery. The mental imagery thing is downstream from that. And I think that my hunch is that you get pretty interesting and robust differences that we haven't yet tracked in the kinds of mental awarenesses and mental imagery that people rely upon in their daily lives. Some people, my bet is, rely on tactile and spatial imagery. Some people rely on visual imagery. Some people rely on other kinds of, maybe bare computational list-like sorts of representations. Like, who knows how people work it out? But part of what's going on there is an attempt to figure out how to use in a person usable code the operations that are being carried out on the wetware.
Right.
So the analogy isn't quite right for a lot of reasons, but if you think about the way that compilers and decompilers work, essentially what you're doing is you're moving back and forth between person usable code and machine code.
Right.
And what we have access to in that kind of introspective way is just the person usable code.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, so I have heard some people suggesting that maybe the thing we're talking about here suggests that you do have the images, but unconsciously. So maybe because there's also this other interesting stuff about Sperling cases where aphantagics can still do the task equally well.
Totally.
Where that, and even in the, kind of Schlichtmann-Landman, Victor Lama kind of stuff where there's, you can get up to 5 seconds delay in certain cases, they can still do it. And so some people have suggested, well, they generate the image, but just not consciously. And it sounds like what you're taking this to suggest is that actually whatever happens at the image level, it's actually the machine code level that's doing the work.
Yeah, that's my guess.
Yeah,
I don't think we have an answer on that kind of question.
Yeah.
And part of the reason is the research on aphantasia is so recent.
Is that how you say it? I've only read it, so I didn't know if that's.
So I say it. I don't know how other people say
it. I say aphantasia.
Yeah.
But okay, yeah, it's very recent. I mean, the one thing, I mean, I didn't realize it was a thing until I got to grad school and we were talking about this speckled hen, and they were like, "Imagine the hen." I was like, "Okay, how many speckles on it?" I was like, "I don't know. I just imagined the hen with speckles. I didn't specify it." And everyone else was like, "Oh, there's 6 on the left side," and I was like, "What the hell are they talking about?" So it really, the main lesson to me was that more work needs to be done, but also there's an assumption which is questioned by this, which is that people tend to think everyone's mind is the same in this respect, right? That all of our experiences are roughly the same. And people are really surprised when you tell them that you don't have mental. I mean, I've had people literally just not believe me. They said, "You're lying." I was like, you don't know how to interpret your own experience. I was like, "I don't know. I kind of do this for a living." So yeah, I just feel like that's a real big assumption that needs to be questioned, that maybe there's this uniform thing called the mind.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in general, that's probably part of the kind of push that I keep sort of angling towards.
Right.
Experiences in every way are unfolding slightly differently on the basis of history, on the basis of context, on the basis of pre-existing assumptions, on the basis of the angle that you're directed towards things. Like all that stuff is affecting the way that experience unfolds.
Absolutely, yeah, that much I agree with. I wonder, so how much, do you think this is attributed to sort of theory ladenness of introspection? Do you buy into this idea at all, that sort of that just like observation can be kind of influenced by theory, so can introspection? So maybe your theory of if you're someone like David Chalmers and you think there are these qualitative simples, maybe you're going to find them. And if you're someone like you who thinks they're more complicated, maybe you're going to find that. And maybe that's not necessarily reflective of what's going on, but reflective of concepts you're using to sort it out.
Yeah. I mean, so this is in the stuff that I've started writing up about the meditation stuff that I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. What I think is super cool is as you shift the kind of concepts that you're using to identify stuff, what you find starts to shift.
Right.
And I mean, my inclination is to think that there's a whole lot of expectation and anticipation and conceptualization that's feeding into all of those kinds of practices. And the only way you're ever getting to anything that really tracks what's there is if you can do it without conceptualizing. And good luck with that.
Yeah.
I mean, we're all really rapid default conceptualizers.
There's no way around that. Yeah.
There might be a way around it, but I think it takes lots of weird practices to hack the operating system. And I'm certainly not there.
This is going to get us into, I guess, what I was hoping we'd get to, which is I don't know how to pronounce this word. So I know you told me once and I forgot already, but it's Yogacara. Yes. Okay. Yeah. So the Yogacara stuff, which honestly, I have a even more passing familiarity, because the stuff that I am more familiar with is not this school, to be honest. So I think this is related to that, right? Because part of the claim is that you can get to a kind of non-conceptual, pure awareness or something like that. Is that part of the view?
Well, it's a point where there's an enormous amount of dispute among the people that we've clustered together as
Uh-huh.
belonging to that school.
Before we go down this road, can you say a little bit for like novices like me about what the school is and who are the people?
Yeah, totally. So I think that I'm trying to figure out what exactly is going to be most useful. So if you look at the way that Buddhist philosophical traditions emerged, what you see around the 4th century of the Common Era is a recognition that when you engage in long bouts of meditative practices, stuff starts to get wonky.
That's a technical term.
Yes, stuff gets weird when you stare at your mind for a while. So what happens is there's a bunch of sort of thinking about how to rework and retool the Buddhist philosophical tradition, which ends up generating the school that's called Mahayana.
Yeah.
The Mahayana school centers its assumptions around individual and collective liberation, rather than just the pursuit of individual nirvana. What you aim for is the cultivation of bodhicitta. That's a sort of boundless compassion for all living beings.
Right. I love that.
In order to do that, you need to really hack the operating system, because we're all embedded in a world where our own interests tend to dominate our ongoing behavior. So what they're trying to do is to figure out how to hack the operating system there, and to make it possible to internalize in a deeply engaged and embodied way that kind of boundless compassion for all living beings. For the Yogacharans, I hope this is the right way into this, they think that there are a couple of shifts that need to be made in the standard models of Buddhist psychology that are operating. The first, so I mentioned earlier the 6 kinds of sense doors.
Yeah.
What they're going to do is they're going to add 2 more.
Right. One's for Dharma and one's for.
Nope. So the first one is going to be Klishthamanas, which is defiled awareness. And the basic thought is that we've got a deeply embedded and habituated tendency to distinguish ourselves from the world that we encounter, and that's actually yielding distortions in the way that we engage in things. Because once we've done that distinguishing, we end up anchoring our drives to the self that we've produced. Okay, so that's the first one. The second is the Alaya Vijnana, and that's the storehouse awareness. Storehouse awareness is basically their model of unconscious processing. Excuse me.
Yeah, no worries.
The way that they're thinking about unconsciousness.
Bryce, do you need to take a break and get some water or?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay.
The way they're thinking about unconscious processes, they think that they're not just facts about your current history, but facts about the history of you as an organism that's embedded and situated in a particular kind of world. And they think that all of the kinds of factors, as I read them, that organize and structure your conceptual space end up being part of the unconscious storehouse. So they think then these 2 additional processes of distinguishing yourself from the world and of anchoring to all these kinds of stored expectations and stored assumptions and stored aspects of the world, collectively, those impact the way that ongoing processing functions in each of the 6 classical systems. So the input systems and the unfolding of thought are all shaped by those kinds of processes.
Right.
And the basic thought is then that as we encounter the world, what we encounter is not things as they actually are, but things that have been shaped by the seeds that are present in the unconscious storehouse, which are ran through diluted self-awareness, such that when they impact the right kinds of stimuli and conditions, they generate a mental event, which is organized and categorized in ways that make sense in light of those two sorts of things. So that's a long answer, but
Yeah.
it gets us to how it links up to the thing that I said right before,
Right.
which is basically all of our engagement with the world is shaped by the things that are in the unconscious storehouse and by that tendency to bifurcate ourselves from the world. And until you eliminate, or as they often put it, you burn all the seeds in the unconscious storehouse, you're going to be acting in ways that are anchored to those facts about history and to those facts about expectations. And you're going to be categorizing and conceptualizing your patterns of thought in accordance with those stored expectations.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It connects up with the theory ladeness point in a way, right? Because that seems like it's but so I mean, I'm confused about where the mental event. So these things those things are not mental events yet before they're filtered through. So it's a kind of direct input that then is turned into a mental event by being processed in this way or filtered in that way? Or is it mental already, but in a pure sense and then distorted by being passed through there?
Yeah, I mean, this storehouse is called storehouse consciousness or storehouse awareness. So it is something that's functioning as a cause of experience.
Mhm.
But I think maybe a way to think about it, I haven't thought about this a lot, and I'm not sure if it's fair to the classical authors. And everywhere that I'm thinking about this stuff, I'm running it through all sorts of my own stuff. So it's always how Bryce encounters the Yogacara texts.
Right.
But
Hence the
I
neuro
think,
yogacara.
yeah, exactly. So if you think about the way that a seeing event triggers an internal cascade, what's happening is, in a sense, stored expectations and stored assumptions are interacting with the sensory data, and those are lumped together and categorized by an aspect of thought, which then generates the next unfolding of behavior. There's always going to be a lot. I mean, all these stories are process stories for them, and you're always going to have cascades of events. So I see something, it interacts with the stored expectations, that triggers a pattern of thought, which shifts my attention, which now generates a new set of inputs, which then interacts in that way, which triggers a feeling, which then leads me to engage in approach behavior, which then shifts the way that I'm seeing things. And it's going to be that constant flow of information through the system that generates something like the experience of being an embodied, situated self living in a world.
So the input to those to the unconscious storehouse is itself a mental event already.
So I want to be careful there. Everything you say or do leaves a trace in the storehouse, which will then serve as the seed for an experience, which you could call the fruit, when that seed is exposed to the kinds of causes and conditions that activate it and generate an experience on its basis.
So, I mean, so the input to those systems is an experience or not?
often, but they can be, you can engage in repetitive patterns of action that you're not recognizing or consciously paying attention to, that are nonetheless structuring and shaping both the world that you're embedded in and the way that you're going to engage with that in the future.
Right.
That's the kind of thing they're thinking about.
Right.
For these folks, I mean, they think that all of these unfoldings are bundles of psychophysical kinds of events. That's not necessarily the story that I want to tell. I tell it in terms of the way that, this is the neuro part, the way that different kinds of bodily systems are adapting the past experience in ways that open up certain kinds of possibilities. So differences in early oxytocin levels can shape the way that parental feedback or caregiver feedback is categorized, which can then have a downstream effect later in life in how willing you are to seek help
Right.
from another person when you're feeling bad. What's happening there is the seeds that make it possible for you to engage in those kinds of behaviors later in life are laid down early in life by shifting the dynamics of the underlying system through those interactions with the caregiver. Is that experience, is it conscious? Sometimes.
Okay.
But I think that that's probably the levels of the hormones in that case are the things that are serving as the trace.
Right. I mean, but then you get a version, it sounds like, even in that system, of a kind of hard like problem of if both these things can occur, then what explains why one results in an experience and the other doesn't?
I don't have answers to those kinds of questions, I think. I think that in general, what a person is aware of at any point in time are the outputs of numerous interacting processes which are contributing to the way that they encounter the world.
Yeah.
I think that that's something that just about everybody should be happy with, but I don't think I have a good answer to why some of these end up being conscious and some of them don't.
Yeah, but do you recognize that you should have an answer to that, or is that something you think
No.
you don't think you need an answer to it?
No.
Okay, cool. I want to ask just one final question, which hopefully won't take too long. But I want to. So when you're burning the seeds, if you succeed in that, I don't know if I'm using that term correctly, but I get the sense that they think that you're getting more to the fundamental nature of things.
Yeah.
But why think that? Why think that these meditative, introspective happenings of the weirdness, the wonkiness? Why shouldn't the wonkiness itself kind of clue us into that maybe that's the illusion? There's where
it does.
Okay. It
Yeah,
does.
I mean, I think that one of the first steps along this trajectory is getting to the point where you realize that the things that we impute to ourselves and to the world are in some sense illusions. All of them.
Right. But even
doesn't.
the wonky stuff is an illusion too. So even so when you get to the pure stuff, why not think it there?
The folks who are operating within a Buddhist soteriological framework have an answer for that question.
Okay.
And their answer is that the pursuit of the path that was laid down by the Buddha gives you an awareness and a knowledge and an understanding of how things really are.
Appeal to authority.
From my perspective, I'm not at all inclined to think that typically functioning minds, I think they would agree with the way that I'm just going to put this. Typically functioning minds are never going to get to an awareness and a knowledge of how things really are. I am not inclined most days to think that atypical minds get there either, but I think we can do better. And I think we can do better by realizing the constructed nature of the vast majority of our categories and our experiences.
Yeah.
I think.
So, I mean, but so that's my real question though, is why think you're doing better as opposed to getting worse at what's going on?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that comes downstream when we see if it's true that getting rid of reified categories opens up less dogmatic, less hostile, less antagonistic patterns of behavior. Whether it opens up better ways of navigating deeply entrenched intergroup hostilities,
Right.
whether it helps us to get rid of really problematic kinds of drives that tend to show up because we assume that things are going to be roughly like they were yesterday.
Right. No, and I understand that somehow it's in a sense of myself is different from you, which is going to make me be mean to you or aggressive towards you. And if I understood that somehow we were the same, that I would be more open towards treating you like I treat myself or something like that. I get that. But and I agree those are valuable goals. And if something moves us in that direction, then I think that's a valuable thing. So I understand what you're saying. But at a more abstracted, theoretical, from the mind, we want to understand its nature point of view, it doesn't seem like that carries much weight. Because if we want to know what the mind really is, and you guys are saying it's really all these little bits that are complicated and you're making a mistake thinking they're simple,
Yeah.
and other people are saying, no, there's really the simple things in there. It's not clear to me who's got the high ground introspectively at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a whole lot to say introspectively about who's right there. I think who's right ends up being a function of what the structure of individual and social worlds end up looking like. I mean,
Yeah,
at the end of
that's
the
like
day,
a real pragmatism, right? That's pragmatism.
it's a deeply pragmatic kind of perspective,
Right.
and I think that runs through just about the entirety of the Buddhist tradition in some way or another.
Right.
For the Yogacarans, a lot of it's tied up with engaging in practical activity aimed at making the world a better place for living things.
Yeah, in decreasing suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know only that famous story about the Buddha and the arrow, right? So don't worry about who shot me, get the arrow out. That's an important point. Yeah. So I agree. So that's interesting that there's so much pragmatic stuff built in that they're willing to bank a theory of the mind on it. I think that's interesting. That's an interesting approach. Myself, I don't know. I wish it were the case that we could rationally understand that you and I are not that different, and therefore I should be obligated. So I would like to hack the system by increasing rationality in that way. You think it would get the same goal, or do you think it has to be experiential?
Well, so I think that's actually a really interesting point about stuff we've been talking about all along, I think. So you can play with a fun little thought experiment that can sort of get you to see things conceptually from a Buddhist perspective. So here's the thought experiment. You recognize already, if you accept the not self doctrine, that anytime you act in a way that benefits a future instance of yourself, you're acting out of generosity and you're acting out of care.
Right.
So in order to engage in practical activity of any sort, you have to be organizing your behavior by those kinds of compassion and by those kinds of concern for somebody that's not you. The problem is you've got no good reason to focus on that guy rather than focusing on all the other people who are experiencing whatever kinds of suffering.
Right.
And you can work to expand that out and show that we're already engaged in, compassionate and whatever action with our family, with our friends, with our colleagues, whoever else it happens to be, and you can start playing around with those boundaries. That's unlikely to motivate behavior. Like just being told that and just understanding it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what the focus on meditative practices is supposed to do is to get you to the point where you work through that, whether you're doing so by conceptually directing yourself or by disclosing something that's already there. It doesn't really matter. But what you're doing is you're forcing the system to internalize that kind of understanding. And in doing so, you shift the behavioral profile of the person who's engaging in actions. I think we see that all over the place, and it's not just in the context of compassion or empathy or those kinds of things. Think about, for example, the amount of work it takes to internalize the recognition that mountains are processes, not entities.
Yeah.
Right?
Hard.
That's somebody who's a geologist can see a rock face and can track patterns of temporal variation that reveal the ways in which the process is unfolded. Most of us can't.
Right.
And once you've internalized that, the structure of the mountain, like there's still a mountain there, but it shows up slightly different to you because you've internalized that sort of assumption. And you've done so through practical engagement with the kinds of tasks that require you to engage with the mountain as a process and not as an entity. I think that's the basic underlying Buddhist thought.
Yeah.
It's
So
habituation to action.
do you think, I mean, this is sort of a far afield, but do you think that if, we were able to augment ourselves, transhumanist style, and I know there's, the morality pill, there's oxytocin and all that stuff, but they have side effects, they highlight in-group stuff like that. So
Totally.
those aren't great. But what if we could hack the rationality system to get people to really feel the force of like Kant's arguments that, the whole ground for being an agent assumes that I choose my thing, so I got to let you choose too. Do you think, I mean, it just seems to me that it's just a default. We're biological systems, we're built this way, but we could build a better one that was more effective, that bypassed all that stuff you're talking about and focused on the thing I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, my bet is we messed that up to the extent that we try to pursue it.
Yeah,
in part because most of us don't have a good sense of what it would take to actually get the system in the right state.
Mm-hmm.
But I think more importantly, what something like that would have to do is affect not just rational judgment, but patterns of feeling and hedonic response, patterns of attention and awareness, patterns of practical motivation, patterns of the things that you perceive and select out of a scene. All those things have to get transformed to shift your behavioral profile. And the reason is because in most situations, we never just see things. We see things and that shifts our attention, and that shifts the motivations we have, and that shifts the way that we're feeling at a particular point. And those things are constantly in dynamic action with one another. And what the practices that emerged across these traditions are supposed to do, I think, is to help you to bring those systems into a new state of equilibrium, where they open up new classes of possibilities.
Yeah, And I think that way of thinking about it is really compelling to me. So I like that. I guess I lied earlier. I have one last question, which is that you said you might, think in your book that you're writing a very mysterious but exciting book yet to come out on these themes, that you might think, I don't know if you're joking, but you said you were thinking of maybe calling it Why I Am a Buddhist, in contradistinction to a certain famous Why I'm Not a Buddhist. And if I understood the Why I'm Not a Buddhist argument, it was that it's a religion and he's not religious. That's maybe oversimplifying, but that's a sense of, that's sort of it. So what was your point in saying that?
So I think what I said is why I am a neuroyogacharan.
Oh, okay, I thought you said Why I Am a Buddhist. Okay, I might have read too much into it.
So I think that Evan's book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist, is a nice set of challenges to the easy acceptance of Buddhist dogma and treating it as something that you can just drop into the current understanding of science.
Right.
So if you think of something like Robert Wright's Why Buddhism is True, what he's doing is trying to take the things that he sees as core key ideas from Buddhism and show that they're actually reflected in his brand of preferred evolutionary psychology.
Right.
And Evan's going in for a criticism of that and suggesting that to really understand and engage with Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist practice, you need to take the weird aspects, the things that show up to us as weird, way more seriously.
Right.
They're deeply committed to stories about multiple past lives,
right,
multiple future lives. And they're deeply committed to particular stories about karma and stories about rebirth that you can't just selectively drop out and say that Buddhism is the right story. And the other thing that he pushes back on is the willingness to say that cognitive science has demonstrated that there is no self, because at most it's shown that the self is implemented by multiple interacting processes, or that it's an ongoing unfolding of different kinds of mental events.
Right.
So he thinks that those kinds of things have been distorted. When I say I've thought seriously about calling my book Why I Am a Neuroyogacharan, I think that what I'm trying to do is to suggest that picking up on themes from the classical Yogacara framework and remixing them with neuro stuff yields a new kind of way of engaging with the relationship between ethics and science, a new way of engaging with questions about the biology of cognition. And it starts to open up possibilities that wouldn't have been available either from the perspective of the relevant bits of cognitive science or from the relevant bits of the Buddhist tradition.
Mm.
And in order for that to work, you have to recognize that what you're doing is a new kind of thing. Like the classical Yogacara philosophers, I think that meditative practice is pretty important. I'm convinced that they're right, that there's something about the sense of self which can be worked out of your ongoing experience, but that can also just disappear in cases of depersonalization and derealization. And understanding how that functions gives us better traction on what's actually going on in the production of self and the way that it functions in everyday life. And I think that the Yogacharans are right that in a lot of ways, our everyday engagement with the world is much closer to a kind of illusory representation than we often like to admit. And recognizing that helps to feed into a better understanding of the relationship between ethical and political values and our understanding of the relevant science.
Yeah, wow, that's awesome. There's 1,000 things I want to ask after you say that, but I have to. I mean, I'm seeing the time here and understanding that you have a life. So I got to let you go. Maybe when this book comes out someday, you can come back on and we'll talk about it after I've got a chance to
Yeah,
read it.
let's do it. That'd be fun.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. So usually what I end the show is I ask if there's anything which hasn't come up, which you wanted to have come up. And the answer can be no.
I think my answer is no.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you, Bryce, so much. I enjoyed this conversation. I learned a lot. I learned a lot in general from you reading your work and interacting on Twitter, but this has been tremendous for me. I really appreciate it.
It's super fun.
Yeah, super fun. So just hang on a second. I'll say bye off the air if you don't mind.
Cool. Cheers.
Figure out how to stop this recording.